Let's do this. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. We're going to talk to you about third-party cookies and the privacy-first future that we're all about to embark on together, whether we like it or not. So who's talking to you today? I am Jenna Watson. I am the VP of Digital Media here at DAC, and that's my buddy Dan. Dan, you want to talk about yourself?
I run technology and data for the DAC group, as well as lead our analytics practice, Prove Intelligence.
But this is also us. So, you know, here you can see like pre-COVID haircut. I obviously grew mine out, so did Dan. You can't really tell the difference, but terrible things have happened to us recently. We thought we would make a joke. You'll find that this isn't the most serious presentation, even though it's a very serious topic, because we wanted to make sure that we're in line with the themes you're going to hear today. So lots of bird references. Also, we're the harbingers of doom when it comes to third-party cookies, so we thought we would make a little light of that as well. So just to tee this up for everybody who's here, this is a pretty dense topic, and we only have an hour today. So what we'll ask you to do, Dan's going to take you through the agenda in just 1 second. You'll see it's pretty deep. So let's keep questions into, oops, how did that happen? Let's keep questions into the chat bar, and we will address them in the order that they come in at the end of the session, okay? So Dan, you want to take them through the agenda, please?
Perfect, I will. Thanks, Jenna, and welcome everybody. So with this topic, we found it to be, with the people we've shared it with so far, there's a lot of value in making sure everybody is aligned about the way things are today before we start speaking about the way things are going to be tomorrow, because it's much more difficult to really understand the context of the changes if you don't have a real sound vision and understanding of the way things work today. So you'll forgive us if it's a little remedial, but we're going to take a little bit of a trip in the Wayback Machine and talk about the history of web tracking and cookies, a primer on first, second, and third-party data, so we all are on the same page, and then what use cases work in the digital marketing, especially the performance media industry. What are the meaningful use cases that affect us every day and what's going to happen? And then we can talk with a little bit more clarity about the shift in this space, what's happening, how these new proposals are going to affect us. And then ultimately, we all want to leave here today with a bit of an action plan about what we should do about it going forward. So with that, we'll jump right in, and hopefully we can track along with this as we go. So let's start with a little bit of the background. So way back in the day, and I started in this business, Jen and I have both been around since, you know, the 1990s in the internet business.
Watch it. But yes.
It's all very true. It was a lot simpler, and you have to understand when, and again, this will get remedial here. When a user interacts through a device or a browser with a website, and they address that website, a website is a composition of hundreds and today thousands of concurrent requests or serialized requests that come one after another and load themselves into your browser and present the information to you. Log files are kept by IT professionals. Actually, it was always designed to make IT operations run very smoothly, understand who's consuming services, how the CPU can be monitored, whether things are delivering correctly or whether there are errors. But of course, marketers, being the industrious creatures that we are, we thought, wouldn't it be great? There's lots of valuable information in there, and if I can get my hands on it and aggregate it, I can produce reports that look like this, and these are awesome. This is a platform called Webalizer, back in the 90s, back when hits and visits were the thing that mattered. And I used to actually provide these reports to my very first clients in this industry way back in 1997 or 98. It was very interesting to see their eyes light up because people had never seen their business presented to them in such a quantifiable and objective way. So it was super interesting. But again, it was fairly straightforward, and it was really oriented in hits and visits. So now when you think about the cookie, what happens here is right around the same time as I was putting this in front of clients, JavaScript was kind of formally released, and part of that was the ability now during this concurrent transaction between the browser and the web server, we could now write a little piece of code and we could drop it on the user's browser, so that when they came back, we would have a little ID tag and we could remember them. Again, this wasn't really for marketers, this was for application developers, because it allowed us to maintain what we call state in software development, where I could understand the context of a visit and give an enhanced experience or add more specific functionality to my application because I have a token with which I can remember the user. Of course, marketers said, wow, if I could grab that data, put interesting stuff in it, bundle it up with the original log file data, now I would have even better visitor-centric data. And that became super powerful, and it's what led to all the modern tools and toys that we love and enjoy today, Urchin Analytics, which became GA, and all of the other JavaScript-driven marketing technology that we kind of live and breathe with today. So what about pixels? People say, yeah, well, we're going to deploy this pixel or that pixel. And pixels are really just the OG of external data collection. So, and it used to actually be, before cookies, it was a 1-by-1 pixel that you could put and call it from a different server and then get their log files and understand, understand how many people consumed that page from a different context, from the context of somebody that wasn't the actually hosting domain. So here we have the, a shoestore.com engaging with its server, delivering code, and then in that code, you could actually put in an image tag that would say, from adtech.com, bring in this pixel image, and then you could aggregate the adtech.com web server log files, and you could get a summary of how many people across all these different domains consumed this pixel, which would give insight to AdTech here in this context about how many people have seen their content and what kind of domains were generating that. Of course, this all became JavaScript, and now we still call it cookies because we're nostalgic. So when you drop your Facebook conversion cookie or your Google cookie, pixel on your conversion page, it's really just a JavaScript call that is dropping a cookie. So when we think in terms of party, so if we understand that these cookies get dropped onto our browser by the code on the web server, where's the party? And the party really is to do with the relationship between the user and the technology placing the cookie. There's some misconception, especially as we look down the barrel of what's coming, is that first party and third party data is a function of the type of information, and that's not really true. In the context of what we're dealing with, it's the technological medium with which it was delivered. So in this case, we have a user navigating to shoestore.com. That's what their browser says. The shoestore.com web server is putting a cookie on that computer, and that is a first party relationship. If later in the day that user finds themselves at another retailer, say tireshop.com, has another linear experience with that web server and that domain and gets another first party cookie, that too is a first party relationship between the user and Tireshop. Now, if these two organizations decided to align themselves through some mutually known identifier, let's say they're both getting login credentials from the user and they can share their data and they can augment their profiles, then that becomes a second party relationship. So put simply, in this context, second party data is somebody else's first party data that you're able to connect with, okay? So let's go back to ShoeStore now and look, when we are interfacing with shoestore.com, if the administrators of ShoeStore wanted to deploy some ad technology, they could put a JavaScript tag inside their HTML code, which would render a cookie from AdTech, so one of the many ad technology providers out there. And that cookie is being delivered against the domain of one that isn't in the header of the browser. And that's a third party. And the benefits of these are numerous, which we'll discuss in a minute, but often they're anonymous because all it needs to say is, hey, do you have one of these cookies yet? Yes or no? If no, deploy one, and I'll give you a unique identifier that I can read next time, and I can build a profile. And if at any point in the future you happen to identify yourself, I can append your profile with your actual known identity, and now I've got this rich data store. And the reason that's so valuable from an ad tech point of view is because they can deploy themselves not only on ShoeStore, but as the user goes about his business on news and retail and social sites, then that user can be tracked across those sites. And of course, not just that user, but all kinds of users, hundreds or thousands of millions of users. And of course, the compounding value of that intelligence and that data can be quite meaningful. So as we think through that context of first, second, and third party, it's important for us to understand how we actually use this data commonly on a day-to-day basis. So let's go through a couple of use cases. So in number one here, we have a user, and in the context of all of these examples, fashion.com is the advertiser, okay? So they're the person who is really relying on that data to move their business forward. So when a user comes to fashion.com, okay, and let's say that they're participating in the GDN, the Google Display Network, a third-party cookie would be set by GDN on that user's browser. Later on, that user is on some other retailer that happens to be participating in the GDN. That cookie can be read, acted upon, and a media transaction can occur, and that's how we get retargeting. When we put our ad, the advertiser puts an ad in front of somebody that's been to their domain in the past, and then we bid on them and we put a message in front of them. That's a very common use case that's heavily reliant on third-party data. Second use case here, we've got a user who's on a news site or social interest site. They see an ad because we've decided to bid on it programmatically with a platform like Trade Desk. We register that impression. Later on, that user comes back to the advertiser's domain. That cookie can be read, and at the moment of a conversion, we get interesting signals that help us understand reach and attribution, or a concept of a view-through conversion, which is to say we can start to understand the influence that this upper funnel media had on ultimately driving transactions in our store. Third use case here, we have a user at a shoestore.com. So it's not the advertiser, but it's in the same sphere. It's a fashion-related industry. We've got a DMP slash DSP, excuse me, like Criteo, that is going to register that interest and observe behavior. Later on, that user could be on a news site where we have access to that same audience data. That third-party signal can be read, and we can make a decision to bid on that impression. And that's where we get behavioral targeting lookalike, or where we can find people who are considered in market or have an affinity for our products and services. And then finally, similar to number three, the user who's on a news site, who may be registered with a service like BlueKai for audience building and another DMP service. A cookie can be placed later on. A user comes back to the advertiser's website where we're also participating with that same DMP service. We can pick up on that signal, and then we can modify the experience or the offer that we present to that particular user. And that use case is really all about personalization and A/B testing. So this is by no means a exhaustive list of every single different use case in the marketing world for third-party cookies, but we believe it covers pretty much 95% of them. And it's certainly the ones that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, and that we're most interested with understanding how the changes that are coming are going to influence us. So with that, I'll let Jenna give you a bit of a look into what's happening there.
You let me explain what? So thank you, Dan. That was a very good primer. So those of us that forgot that pixels are basically the old school version of cookies and forgot how all of this works, thank you so much for explaining that. It's good to always be reminded of where we came from so that we can understand where we're going. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is what's actually happening. But before we talk about what's actually happening, we need to talk about why. So this has been ongoing for about a decade, honestly, where there's kind of two different tracks here. Number one is users, John Q. Public, internet user number one. They're demanding more privacy and transparency, choice, and control over how their personal browsing behavior and personal data is used. On the other track, there's legislation happening as well. So things like GDPR, CCPA, PIPEDA, et cetera. So these two things are really converging, and this has been ongoing. But what you're about to see with the death of the third-party cookies is no doubt the end of a chapter. The way that we have grown very accustomed to using third-party data in our digital marketing is absolutely going to change. So when we think about who, I guess, or why, it's the browsers that we need to think about. So it's the browsers that are ones that are actively blocking the third-party cookies. But what's interesting to note is that when we talk about the end of third-party cookies, which is 2022, there are already major browsers that already block them by default. So Safari, Firefox, Edge, and Brave, for example, already block third-party cookies today. But part of this reason is because that's who they are, for lack of a better way to say it. So, Safari already blocking these, Safari being an Apple product, Apple has really led the charge in this whole privacy thing. They said, we are the ones that are going to be champions of privacy. So lately you will have read about things like ATT, App Tracking Transparency, all the various iterations of Safari's ITP releases. In doing these things, you've essentially got very obvious and active user behavior over how that privacy is controlled. So in the screenshot on the right, if you've been doing your updates for you Apple users, you should be getting these now when you're getting a native pop-up in-app saying, this is how we use your data, do you agree or not? And additionally, you know, even though Safari has been chipping away at third-party cookie incrementality for several years now, again, if you're doing your updates on Safari, these third-party cookies are blocked completely by Safari for all users. So Apple has really been the one saying, we're the privacy guys, come browse with us, as it were. But we don't really care, honestly, because what's really happening is in mid to late 2022, and we don't know the date yet, but Chrome is also going to join that no third-party cookie party. And that really signals the end of third-party cookies as we know them, because Chrome is the big guy in this mix. So this is just showing the market share of all the popular browsers. And you can see that Chrome is at 65% and growing every single year. Safari is decent, but it's still sub 20 and losing every year. So you can see that once Chrome joins this anti-party party, they're actually going to, there won't be a use case that's viable on any browser for using these third-party cookies. So what does this mean then? Remembering the 4 use cases that Dan set up for us: retargeting, view-throughs, behavioral, personalization. So when we take away these cookies, and pay attention, children, this is a good lesson for us, and it's nicely color-coded by Dan, so thanks, Dan. When these go away, we lose that interconnectivity between these third parties, so the AdTech in this example. And when we lose that connectivity, we lose our ability to put together the chain of events the user went through. So essentially, before we had a fully built chain, now we've got kind of 2 vertical things happening with nothing in the middle to bring them together. That's why everybody cares. This is why this is a big deal, and this is why we really have to understand how it's changing. So to bring this a little bit more to life, to give you an example of how this comes to life in media. So these are my very real screenshots. I was looking at this pair of pants, and then later on I was going to read the headlines, and I saw that very same pair of pants remarketed to me in a display ad. That direct one-to-one use case for remarketing, where I looked at product X and later I see product X, even though I am anonymous and I'm only identified by a third-party cookie, that piece will go away. So targeting individuals based on their specific history won't be possible because of those anonymous profiles and the ability to really understand what a person has done and then serve that same thing to that individual. And individual is the word you should be kind of keeping in the back of your mind as we go through this today. So that's kind of what's going to happen from a can't do. What you still will be able to do in digital media, though, is you can go play happily and skipping around in your lovely walled gardens. So, for example, you can still advertise in Google properties. Ads is less important here because it's not as reliant on cookie data, but YouTube, Discovery, Gmail ads, for example, you can go use that really great targeting that Google has on its customers, because that's all a first-party agreement. You're still interacting with Google, even though it's YouTube, Google, even though it's Gmail, for example. So it's still first-party. And better yet, you're usually authenticated. So your little round picture up in the corner, when you're on any Google property, you're actually signed in, you're authenticated, so it's even better. However, when you think about GDN, which is the Google Display Network, that is a series of other people's domains. And so theoretically, that falls apart. The ability to track a person from domain A to B to C and understand that full thread, that's going to go away. You can go play around with Facebook and Instagram, who have amazing targeting, and it's targeting people who have self-submitted, like I am this person at this age and this relationship status living here and I follow these people, right? That's still going to exist for you. But today, if someone comes to your website, we can go retarget them when they're on Facebook and Instagram later. That is going to be a changed use case / impossible on a one-to-one basis, because that third-party cookie that allows you to target anonymous people later is going to be broken. You're also going to see a lot of solutions that are basically similar to this one. So the Trade Desk is spearheading the Unified ID 2.0 solution. So basically, they've created a different authenticated ID solution. And what that does is create a co-op of sorts that basically makes one large second-party agreement. So Trade Desk is like the master DSP of all DSPs, right? That connects into several others and publishers and networks. So they can all get together and decide to share an authenticated ID with one another so that they can advertise within that newly built walled garden of their own. Dan's fairly bullish on this. I am less so on its efficacy, because essentially, as a user, even though we check off on T's and C's every time we want to use something or every time we want to read something, and we don't even read them. But basically that second party agreement that they've entered into with one another, we as consumers aren't necessarily aware of. And so it's not exactly in the spirit of the privacy changes. So we'll have to wait and see how that one works. So that's what you can't do and can do in media. And now Dan's going to show you what you can and can't do in analytics.
Perfect. Thanks, Jenna.
Yep.
So following on from Jenna's experience with her pants and then her retargeting in the New York Times, when we think about what that advertiser might do with the data they can pick up there, anything that's passive or non-clicked or non-event driven and collected in a third-party context. In this example, you can see anybody familiar with Google Analytics who does channel grouping and wants to do impression-based display and set that up as a channel by ingesting their display impression data from their ad server, will soon see that they can't do that anymore. They're not going to be able to see specifically that a user was influenced by witnessing an impression and then later coming through and either converting or not. Anything else that is similar to that in an anonymous, non-authenticated context that is bound to a singular user identity, that's where we're going to run into trouble. However, it's important to understand a couple of things. One is all the things that are breaking, there's proposed use cases, there's proposed technology to change that, which we're going to get into in a minute. But fundamentally, don't forget a few things. Number one, most of your analytics data that you rely on today is first party. It's last touch, last click. It was a signal sent to you willingly by a user that clicked on a link or then engaged with your website and accepted your cookie policy. So you've got those signals if you've configured it correctly. Really important to understand. The fidelity of that first party data is a bit in question, and it's not really, it's a little out of scope for today's conversation, but ITP is a big thing, and there's a lot of work, a lot of changes going on in first party data collection through JavaScript as well, and I urge you to look into that. But you're seeing a lot of shift to server-side data collection to get around those restrictions as well. So that's going to only improve fidelity. The easiest way to explain this is anybody that does online banking, and they remember your kind of access card number with all the stars in it to keep it kind of secure. And even when you clear your superficial cookies in your browser, that persists. That's because it was set using server-side technology and not JavaScript. So they're a little more resilient. And the reason being is that there's a belief that if the application developers are dropping cookies, then they're much more trustworthy and much more rigored. There's more rigor that goes into them than some snippet of JavaScript that some media person dropped into your CMS. So server-side data collection, it's going to happen on the analytics front. So watch out for that. Always remember, augment and bind all your first-party data. You've got CRM and point of sale and email data. Why not bind it with your web analytics to tell a fuller story? Remember, just because you collected it in a first-party context doesn't mean the data is personally identifiable. I think that the PII circle lives within the first-party circle for sure. We actually use a term at the agency we call zero-party data. If somebody comes to a form on your website and willingly tells you their name, address, phone number, and email, then hits a button, that is better than first-party data. That's an acknowledgement of a relationship. That's a zero-party transaction, and you should really protect that and make sure you're using that appropriately. But all the other signals and trails people leave behind, how long they dwell on something, whether or not they interact with this button or that button, if they read the specs or they open up the light box to get more information, all of those signals are critical to understanding your consumers, and all of that is first party, and it should be leveraged appropriately. And then, of course, there's nothing stopping you from modeling and doing data science and segmentation around all of the first-party data that you have within your ecosystem so that you can prepare to start leveraging that in these second-party ecosystems that are going to thrive in this new world. So now we've done that kind of remedial background stuff. Let's talk about what's happening in the space right now. So anybody that's heard of the Privacy Sandbox has probably heard of, it's the Google Privacy Sandbox, or is it Chrome or Chromium? And the reality is Chromium is sort of an open source community upon which Chrome is built and is owned by Google. And the Privacy Sandbox is absolutely a Google initiative. It's been around for some time now, but it's really come into the headlines recently since there's been this declaration that there will be no rip and replacement for third-party cookies. There will be new systems to satisfy the necessary use cases that third-party cookies provide today, but they will preserve privacy of the data subjects and the users so that we cannot identify individual people. And that's really the sandbox. So it's a whole list of early concepts and proposals about API-driven methods to solve a ton of use cases, and not just marketing, right? They have to keep, marketing is a big part of it. The free and open web runs on advertising, and they can't just say, okay, we're taking this away, it's not going to work anymore, and leave all of those gaps in the diagram that Jenna showed you earlier. We have to find a suitable replacement mechanism, and that's sort of what some of these proposals aim to do. So just to give you sort of the highlights of what I've been able to sort of summarize from the Privacy Sandbox. The first one, use cases for selecting and delivering relevant advertising, Flock and Turtle. We're going to talk at length in a moment here about Flock specifically. The measurement of performance and conversions, especially for upper funnel and multi-touch advertising, again, preserving user privacy, that's a use case that needs to be addressed, and there are a series of proposals for that. Additionally, combating spam and fraud. Anybody that's interacted with a CAPTCHA recently, or where you have to pick the bicycles or the palm trees or the traffic lights out of the 9 boxes and then hit the go button to prove that you're a human, guess what? A lot of those tools run on third-party cookie technology, so they're all going to have a suitable replacement method so that they can continue to exist. Combating fingerprinting and preserving IP address security. There are already proposals in the sandbox aimed at thwarting people's attempts to circumvent the redaction of third-party cookie data. So, you know, everyone knows that people will be looking for workarounds or fissures in the wall. It's not going to happen. There are methods in place to try to preserve that and give people an opportunity to participate in that appropriately. And then ultimately, the fifth one here I found very interesting. Many businesses, certainly many we deal with, are larger companies that run multiple brands. Restaurant holding company with multiple restaurant brands is a great example. There's a strong argument that consumers, as they go between restaurants, are still first party to that organization. So there needs to be a method with which organizations can declare a first party group of domains and group them together and still paint within the lines and preserve privacy. So very interesting, very rich. If anyone's having trouble sleeping, there's a ton of white papers on GitHub that will get you right off to bed. No problem at all. It's very rich and dense material, but very interesting nonetheless. So let's talk about Flock and why everything is so ornithologically oriented. I guess Flock was like the first thing, because there's two parts to what goes on here. The first part is, how do I create an identifier that respects an individual's privacy that I can rely on to do stuff? That's number one. And then number two is, what is the stuff that we do with that identifier, and how do I manage the commercial transactions that will occur around that and the whole ecosystem of describing and dimensionalizing behavior? So there's identification, and then there's doing stuff with the identification. Flock is that identification one, and that's the one that's driving everything, and it may very well become the replacement for third-party cookies across the industry. And because it's Flock, everybody got clever and said, well, it's a flock of birds, and then every subsequent thing became ornithologically related, and it's quite hilarious. The big thing with Flock is no personal data will ever leave your browser ever again, and that's a big statement, and we'll talk about how that's going to work in a second. What came next was Turtle Dove, which was really the first proposal about how to handle the clearance prices and the auction and the commercial space around selling and buying advertising, and then that became Fledge, which looks like it's the leading proposal on the table right now. Interestingly, on its way to becoming that, every AdTech and its brother came in with its own bird relevant, sparrow, dovekie, tern, and parrot. All of these different AdTechs that had their own ideas about how they could satisfy the commercial use case of media buying and selling, all got in, but it really looks like Fledge it looks like the winner. There's a real opportunity here, maybe, that on the commercial side of the media world, there might actually be a bit of a VHS and Betamax race, or HD DVD and Blu-ray, where certain ad vendors or ad servers may come out with a argument that their particular way of settling clearance prices for media buys might be a differentiator, and they have a unique secret sauce. So on top of having higher quality traffic, they might have a more competitive commercial model, and that's going to be very interesting to see how that eventuates. Okay, so let's talk about Flock specifically, because to me, this is the backbone of the whole space and how it's going to work. And everything that falls off of this is going to rely on, I need a way to understand who I'm talking to without understanding specifically who I'm talking to. And that's the key. So if you remember our earlier use cases, here we have a user who's in a Chrome browser and they're navigating a variety of different sites, news and retail and social and whatever it may be. And this is happening right now to everybody watching today. It's happening to you right now. You're building a detailed history inside your Chrome browser that basically tells anybody who cares to look where you've been and what you've been doing. What Flock aims to do is to push down all of the coefficients and logic for a sophisticated machine learning model, push that down into your browser, and then locally on your computer, analyze your browser history and make a determination about what cohort you belong to, and then assign you with that cohort identity. And that cohort is going to be a function of your recent behavioral tendencies as indicated by your browser. So a couple of interesting things that are worth mentioning here as I move this forward. Whoop, I went too far. So in this idea, at the moment, a third-party ad tech vendor is picking up a signal and saying, oh, Jenna was interested in these pants, bam, and firing it off to their server. Oh, Jenna was also interested in this, bam, fire it off. And they know that it's Jenna because they have an identity matching thing, and they know that it's jwatson@something.com because of their ability to extract that data. In this model, none of your personal data ever leaves your browser. The only thing that will leave your browser is the cohort ID. And each cohort, and the literature says, each cohort will contain thousands of browsers that have similar recent history. So when you see, in this case, 29056, that number is actually in the screenshot on the right here. I activated my Chrome browser with a few developer flags so I could participate in an early trial of this Flock algorithm, and that's the number I was assigned. Earlier in the day, and I missed the screenshot, I was 17 something something, and then it reprocessed. And at the time, I was in market for a television and some electronics and looking at some other nerdy stuff online. And my understanding is that I and anybody else with that number have a very similar recent history and a similar recent set of interests. I don't know, third bullet point, I don't know who those other people are. They don't know who I am, nor can I ever find out. And I'll only ever be part of one cohort at any given time. As my behavior changes and as my interests change and my recent browser history changes along with it, I will be assigned a different cohort. So 29056 as a community, whoever they are, will exist, and I'll move on into something different. And I'll get a new number, which will be more reflective of what I care about right now. Super interesting, and some really interesting upsides that we'll talk about in just a second here. As you can see, the cohort ID is made available just like now. If you have a domain, if you're adtech.com and you drop a cookie, you can read that adtech.com domain, but nobody else can. In this model, it appears that that cohort ID will be available to any website that wants to ask for it. So you can say, hey, what cohort is this browser in? It's not a person, it's a browser, right? And then you can read it, and then you can do things with it, okay? So again, back to my earlier statement. Identity management, how do I label and identify somebody? And then what do I do about it is the next thing. So that's Flock on this side. We've created this number using machine learning to group together recent browsing history. Now that we've done that, what will advertisers and ad tech providers, so people on the supply side and the demand side of the equation, what will they do with this number? Okay, well, the truth is they'll kind of do what they already do, which is to say, as a user presents to either an advertiser site or a publisher site, their number is going to be read by the technology deployed on those sites, and their activity and interests are going to be observed by these technologies. They'll be reported back to those ad tech platforms, who will then dimensionalize and run their own modeling and segmentation to essentially feed that data back to the demand side and the supply side of the equation so that people can make buying and selling decisions based upon those cohorts. So what does this mean? There are a lot of ad tech partners. And just like today, there are a lot of people managing third-party data. That means that a particular ad tech platform with a description for a particular cohort may differ slightly or a lot from another ad tech with the same cohort ID. okay? These categorizations are a function of those ad tech partners. So if Google Ads is pulling a lot of data or is deployed on electronics related content, and Quantcast is pulling signals from automotive related content, they may see the same cohort, but they'll have different understandings of what they look like. Over time though, over time, we hope to see that refine and become more aligned and more consistent and a little more durable as these cohorts show up more and more and more across more different websites. The big upside here, back to my earlier point about the transience of these cohorts, is I think there's a real opportunity at the moment, and Jen and I lament about this frequently. You know, if when I was in market for TV, all of these different platforms had their third-party cookie that was on my computer signaled, we have a live TV buyer. When I finally made a purchase, I only made that purchase on one system. So one of those ad tech vendors or DSPs recorded a stop signal to say, okay, this person has purchased, take them out of the pool. But there were many others that didn't. And for about 30 to 60 days afterwards, I continued to get pushed advertising for something that I was no longer in market for. My belief is that in the new world, I will move from 29056 to a brand new cohort based on whatever my next set of interests are. And anybody that was targeting in-market TV buyers will still be targeting 29056, and they'll just be different people that come in. And me as a satisfied customer that's moved on, I'll no longer get that advertising. So that's sort of this upside opportunity that I see with a model like this. And it's predicated on some assumptions that there will be some pertinence and persistence to the allocation of these cohort numbers against their actual behavioral signals. But all of that remains to be seen, but I'm really hoping that that's something that we can leverage for benefit. Just quickly here on reporting and conversion measurement. Again, if you want to we want to understand what media people have seen and whether or not it influenced their buying decisions while preserving third-party use cases where I can't actually understand who that person is, then that requires some clever APIs as well. And from what I can tell, the Facebook conversion measurement API is a very similar use case to what's being proposed inside the Privacy Sandbox, in that when a user ultimately makes a purchase and provides that zero-party transactional data to an advertiser, that advertiser could bundle up all of their transactions, ship them off through an API to someone like Facebook that they've advertised with, who would then wash that data against their campaign data that's first party to Facebook, and be able to give you an aggregated understanding to say, okay, of all of your conversions, 15% of them were influenced by your advertising, and our models suggest you could attribute this much revenue to the media spend that you invested with us. So some kind of aggregated results out, aggregated reporting back to the agency or the advertiser running the campaign, and all the while preserving the fact that we're not robbing signals from unsuspecting users in a third-party context. So, Jenna.
You make it sound so criminal, robbing signals from a third-party user.
I know, right? Yeah.
All right, so we're all caught up, right? Everybody's certain that they understand the different first, second, third-party use cases. We understand how cookies are placed. We understand why things are changing and what's happening. Cool, that's good to understand, but so what do we do now, right? It's probably what you're thinking. So a couple of months ago, we partnered with Forrester to do a co-branded study, DAC and Forrester, of decision makers at brands. And we asked them, essentially, what's your biggest challenge in delivering good omni-channel seamless experiences for your customers? And 85% of them said their biggest challenge was deriving actionable insight from their customer data. It's not good, but losing cookies is going to make that problem worse. So it depends whose publication you read. Some of them say that the digital marketing we all love today that relies on third-party data, some of them say, oh, it's only going to be half as effective. Everything's going to go in the toilet and this is going to be terrible. The others say, no, it's going to be like 95% is good, right? And don't sweat it. And I'm actually on the more positive end of that spectrum. I think people who are scared and people who don't want to embrace change are probably down on the low end. People who are looking forward to this, to some of the things that Dan mentioned about how it might actually be much more accurate, actually, would be on the higher end of that. But long story short, there will be change to what we do, but we can't panic. So panicking will get us absolutely nowhere except a trip to the doctor's office for a prescription. So we have a 3-step preparedness plan that we've brought up for you here today. Dan's going to talk about 2 things that we can do in technology and analytics, and I'll tell you how we can get prepared in media. Dan?
Awesome. So obviously, audits for accountants, they sound passive and a little bit boring, but fundamentally, this all needs to start with an objective assessment of understanding how prevalent is third-party cookie data. Jenna, can you flip back to the thing?
Oh, why does it keep doing that? I didn't touch it, I promise. It's because you know why? It wants to keep showing Coolio, because I forgot to tell people to Google Coolio today. And look for a picture.
Don't do that. Getting an objective understanding of how prevalent is third-party data in your performance marketing work stream right now, so that you can understand, okay, here's what I expect is going to shift and change and where I need to be focused. The second thing is understanding your CRM or loyalty data that you've got, that you're accumulating. Where's the quality at there? How addressable, how segmentable is it? How connected is it to web analytics data, and so on? Because it's much of what's going to happen is how savvy you can get with understanding your first-party data so that you can bid more effectively on audiences that match what you consider good to be. That's going to be critical. And participating in any type of second-party world is going to require you to have quality data that you can join up. So those 2 things are sort of critical, number 1. Number 2 is looking at your entire data stack and marketing technology stack that is capable of throwing off and contributing to first-party data collection and signaling. So analytics, marketing automation, CMS, CRM, a good DMP or CDP, even better because that's inherently first-party, a CRO tool that can give you insight into preferences and so on. All of those things that have the ability to operate in a first-party context are the ones that you need to be looking at and trying to wire up, frankly, every signal you can back to that kind of unified 360. This is customer 360, like on steroids. Everyone's been talking about it for a long time, and what the pandemic has done for remote work, I think third-party deprecation is going to do for people getting customer 360 data together. It's really going to accelerate that agenda. And it all roots back to this idea of a durable first-party identifier. So what system in your stack owns the best identifier? How can you make it durable? Meaning, how can you append to it signals that confirm and reconfirm that you've got the right person through email or phone numbers or other tricks and techniques? How do you bake that into your architecture? How do you make sure that your user experience on your website is really promoting the ability to capture and authenticate users? Make no mistake, there will be a land grab for authentication. If you think paywalls or identity walls in front of news content right now is bad, wait until a year from now when so many websites barely give you anything at all until you voluntarily authenticate. And the reason they're going to do that is to build these durable identifiers to make their data more valuable and more usable. Moving forward, the step 2 is to do the work. Audits are great and passive, like I said, but once you've got that assessment and understanding, remediate, fill the gaps, understand your technology partners and what they're doing in terms of Flock and understanding how they're going to operate, switch vendors if you need to, wire up your first-party data to send those signals and get them validated. And please, please, please document everything you're doing along the way. The worst possible thing you can do is go 100 miles an hour changing things and not leave a paper trail for people in future generations who are going to have to rely on this to keep the business moving forward.
Leave your stone tablets.
Jenna.
Then you got all the wiring hooked up. You got everything that you need to, and you've got this really great environment where you're not only collecting your first-party data, but you actually know how to use it. So making sure that you've got really robust personas built out on that CRM data, making sure you know who these audiences are and what they care about. If you have those, then what you can do today, before we lose third-party cookies, you can go out and act like Flock. So what we mean by that is there is already targeting that's available in many platforms that we think will act a lot like Flock based on machine learning. So for example, today we can go by Google in-market and affinity targeting, right? I'm in market for a TV, or I have an affinity for organic products. We can buy that today. And our best guess from reading all of this material out there is that Flock is going to, the target pledge really, the targeting capabilities founded on Flock will act a lot like that native platform targeting that's available today. So go out and test it, see how it works for you. This is also the perfect time to be testing every single thing that you can to really understand what makes your audiences respond. So testing things on your site using conversion rate optimization, personalization, offers, email, because email is going to be huge, right? That's first party, that's one-to-one. So making sure your email is firing on all cylinders. And in media, it's time to test your creative, it's time to test your messages, your frequency, etc. And because getting new users to your CRM and having first party audiences that are authenticated is going to be so critical, you might want to start buying different media. So if you're a very direct response advertiser that's always living for a ROAS or a cost per, you might have to move up funnel because we have to talk to new people that don't already know us. And so that might mean buying from different platforms or buying from things that don't have a direct, an immediate last click kind of response to those, because that's the only way you're going to understand how and where you can get good audiences to your site. So while we can measure today and while we can buy things today in the same exact way, now's the time to go figure out how that all works so that you know it when cookie doomsday does happen. Perfect. So long story short, now's the time. It's constantly changing and there is still a lot of guessing, but we have a great idea and you've seen what that great idea that we think is going to look like. So much to be done, but don't panic and we're here to help. So we're going to take some time now and answer some questions, but if you do have more, we've got tons of material published on our site. You can contact us. If you don't already know somebody here at DAC, you can contact us through our website as well. And let's turn it over to some questions. Let me open up the old question bar. Okay, so I am seeing, one moment, in the question bar. Question number 1, Google Sandbox. Is it encouraged for website developers use regularly if you are running a site? I'm not sure. Is it encouraged for website developers use regularly? Are you asking, is the Google Sandbox encouraged for website developers to use? The Google Sandbox is a series of proposals. So yes, that is where developers would want to go look to get all of this information. You can look under the header of the Privacy Sandbox. Web.dev has lots of great materials there, and you can find it almost anywhere else. Yeah. So I hope I've answered that question correctly. On the second one that I can see is, does the publisher side need to do anything for cohorting? Yes.
Yes.
Dan, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, the publisher side is going to need to, they're going to need to dimensionalize and label cohorts that they identify with appropriate and accurate behavioral interests and report them back to whatever supply side platform that they're representing or deployed with, so that people buying media are going to get an accurate understanding. So 29056 on a news site that's interested in, I may have a affinity for geopolitical information, they're going to need to be savvy enough to wire that up. Again, I can't articulate this enough. No differently than the way they send behavioral signals against third-party cookie identifiers today. The only difference is, instead of the primary key in that data set being my personal GUID, it's my Flock ID, which it's going to have more signals coming to each key. You know, I only provide the signals to my cookie ID, but if I'm in a cohort with 5,000 other people, there's going to be 5,000 times the behavioral signals coming in. And it's up to publishers and AdTech platforms to be consuming those signals, storing them in an appropriate way, and then running their own models to aggregate. Just imagine the noise that's going to come in with that many signals. They're going to need to distill out of 5,000 different signals. Hey, 29056 leans heavily toward these behavioral contexts, and they're the behavioral contexts that they're going to make available for the demand side of the equation to bid on and buy in order to get in front of those eyeballs.
All right, so we only have 9 minutes left, so I'm just going to pick a few questions at random.
Okay, mysterious voice from the background.
Yeah. Clearance DAC presenter voice. Yes, go please.
That's Kieran.
Okay.
She's been awesome helping set this up today.
Okay, so we're going to go with Caitlin Murphy's question. How do you review your marketing stack to see if you're using first party, second party, or third party cookies? How do we do this assessment?
Well, Dan, over to you, my friend.
Good question. Yeah. The truth is you need technically savvy people in front of the controls there. You know, interrogating the DOM or the document object model of your website using the appropriate tools will reveal which cookies are getting placed on your on that user's computer as they browse your sort of digital ecosystem and your websites. They reveal the context or the scope of the cookie, which reveals, is it your domain or is it another domain? Then it's a matter of contacting those ad tech partners and vendors and understanding what is their strategy going forward to adjust this. They're probably going to talk to you about server-side deployments of their code so that you can bind it yourself to a first-party context. Again, that's really where you're going to need technical people to help you understand that and prepare for it. So we're working on this. You know, many of our clients we work with their tech teams because they have bright people internally, and we're sort of advising along the lines with them. And in other cases, we're taking the reins and doing that for them. So yeah, it's a little complicated, but for the people that know what they're doing, it's fairly straightforward. And I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that in the short time we have.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next question is from Lisa Bankson. Will pricing likely...
Sorry, I know Lisa. Hi.
Will pricing likely be reduced now that you won't be adding multiple attributes to a target select group for running media?
I love that question. We've been asked that, and it goes one of two ways. It goes either it's cheaper or it's way more expensive. And here's why. Remember what Dan said about how when he was done with shopping for a TV, he was no longer in 29056. So theoretically, the way the cohorts are built, you will have more than one signal, right? You do more than one thing online. Dan looks at TVs, he also looks at his nerd stuff, and he looks at boats or whatever, right? So Dan is all of those things. But at that time, that particular ad tech vendor would have determined he was more in market for TVs. Ad tech vendor B, though, will have different machine learning running on the background. So ad tech vendor B might decide that Dan's interest in nerdy stuff is actually more of who he is, and he should be targeted with that. And that also is based on the type of content that they serve to, the publications that they have relationships with, etc. So long story short, it's probably not going to get cheaper, no. It actually may get more expensive, but my recommendation that I've made to our clients thus far is if you know what you're testing now, get that in order, because we think there's going to be a giant drop off of people who are terrified, right? When this actually happens, we think people are going to suck out like the tides before a tsunami, right? People are going to drop out of the market. And if you guys know what you're doing today, and you know how to go by audiences today and what they respond to today, you're going to be in good shape for when this happens, no matter if it's more expensive or not. And there should be a little bit of a gulf for you to bid on as well.
Great, thanks, Jenna. And then we'll just do one last question and then wrap up. This is from Cheryl Gray. When you repurchase a product, do you join your old flock or always a new flock? Will we lose understanding of repeat customers?
Oh, wow, that's a terrific
That's a great question. That helps explain it really well.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's still a little bit to be learned. You know, again, we're a year away from whatever this final is going to look like. We have lots of questions around how frequently a flock will aggregate your data and reprocess you and assign you a new number. If you exhibit that question is directly adjacent to my belief that 29056 will always be about the things that it was about when I was in it, right? So that there'll be some persistence to the triggers that drove the number, or is the number just random and it may just change over time? I hope not, because then it misses out on a big opportunity to really refine the value of the understanding that we can build over time. I think repeat customers, don't forget, a customer and a repeat customer as first party.
Make that point.
You'll always get access to that. and you should understand that. And don't forget, you too can pick up a flock ID as a signal, just as an advertiser that owns a website with a well-deployed analytics platform. Reading the flock ID of a browser and getting that cohort identifier is a simple JavaScript call that you post into a variable that you should be posting into a variable in your analytics. So you can start to understand, hey, when I've got a customer and then they come back and buy again, did they have the same flock ID at both purchase times? And then you'll learn about within your particular vertical or space, is there some consistency to the way those IDs are represented? I will add as well, please remember, none of this is one-to-one-to-one. It doesn't mean that the only flock ID is 29056 interested in TVs, and it doesn't mean that the only thing people in 29056 are interested in is television. So they're mutually exclusive. You're not gonna, I believe, when you go to your DSP trade desk and you put in a programmatic buy to reach an audience, you're not gonna be bidding on flock IDs, you're gonna be bidding on descriptors and in-market descriptors exactly the same way.
Same way we do now.
But instead of targeting individually addressable users, the system is going to target flock identities, and it's going to weight them based on its own internal machine learning logic. And I think that's what's going to be really interesting to see how that changes the outputs.
There's one thing just to pile on, Dan, is that we have to remember flock is simply the mechanism for identifying the browsers, right? Flock is the underlying layer. On top of that, the AdTech still have to say, okay, these are the signals and this is what I'm getting out of this flock and this is how we target. Yeah. So flock is the mechanics of the thing. And it's basically like,
Jenna. That's the thing.
Exactly.
Right now, DSP 1, 2, and 3 have their different identities for the same person. If they've managed to unify them through some of the mechanisms that are available, great. In many cases, 5 different DSPs have 5 different identity tokens. In this world, what's being proposed is a singular cohort-based identity token that everybody can learn from and contribute to. And I think that has huge upside and opportunity to refine and improve the quality of the whole space.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan and Jenna. And to everybody on the line, you will be receiving a recording of this presentation. And thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day. Be safe.
Bye.